Hello. Chapter 16 is a very interesting chapter, quite different from all that we've read up till now in the stories of Abraham. For one, Abraham is not the central character in this story, and it rather focuses on the female characters, Sarai and Hagar. Also, the characterization of Abraham is very different in that here he is depicted as being quite passive. So we have here something very different from what we have read up till now. And this chapter indeed raises several questions, primarily, first of all, with regard to their characterization and the evaluation of the characters, the behavior of the different characters, and also in trying to understand what is the role and message of this story, particularly in relation to the previous chapter that we read. So let us remember that the previous chapter, the covenant of the pieces, Brit Ben Abtarim, had a promise, amongst other things, in the first part of the chapter, of offspring to Abraham. And now we read in this chapter an attempt to fulfill this promise. So I will share with you now the chapter, and we will begin reading and trying to unravel this chapter and answer the questions that we've raised. Now, Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So here what's interesting is the description of Hagar giving us the information that she is Egyptian, Hagar Hamitzrit. Why should that be of any import? So for one, we can say may anticipate her behavior at the end of the chapter when she flees down south, apparently trying to get back home. But in addition, it might also be related to the function of Egypt. We already saw that Egypt was described as being very lush, and that was the place that they went down to in times of famine. So when there's no produce in the land, Abraham and Sarai went down to Egypt. Now, when Sarai has no fruit, has no offspring, there is an alternative that is raised here, and that is once again, interestingly enough, connected to Egypt, this time not the land, but rather Hagar, who originates from Egypt and might have very likely been acquired when they were there in Egypt. So Egypt here stands as like an alternative to, on the one hand, the promised land, and perhaps here an alternative in the context of the promise of offspring. What's the idea? Verse 2. So Sarai said to Abraham, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her." Or more literally, I might have translated, perhaps I will build myself by her. That is the proposal. So Sarai offers to give Hagar and try to have offspring via Hagar. Now notice the wording is actually quite focused on Sarai herself. She's not trying to solve Abraham's problem of childlessness, but rather she's focusing on herself. The Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Right? So she's looking to solve her problem of childlessness and her desire for children. We'll note also, as far as the names, Sarai is connected to Sar, minister, and Hagar, which is a real name that appears also in ancient sources, but may have part in a wordplay here. Hagar perhaps related to Hagar as far as a wordplay in the text, not that that's the original source of the name, but in its function here, I believe the names here already play a role in determining the hierarchy between the two women. Namely, there is Sarai, the Sar, like the minister, the ruling minister, and there is Hagar, perhaps the foreigner, right, who is on a lower level, if you will, in context of the names. So Sarai makes a proposal. And here, of course, we're somewhat surprised because we just read in the previous chapter, chapter 15, that God promised Abraham offspring. So what are we suddenly working on a different way to get offspring? This question was already raised by the earlier commentators, Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, for example, from Provence, 13th century. He suggests that there was only a promise for Abraham to have offspring. It wasn't yet explicitly stated that his offspring would be provided via Sarai. That comes only later in the following chapter. So this might not negate the actual promise. Furthermore, he comments and says that Abraham may actually now be willing to go along with this plan of Sarai's because he sees this as an avenue for actualizing the promises of God. What is clear here is that we have a human initiative emanating from Sarai to try to have children, and not only resting on awaiting the fulfillment of promises, but rather taking action in order to accomplish the desired goal of having offspring. One other comment I want to make on this verse is how Sarai relates to her childlessness. Note that she says, "The Lord has restrained me from bearing children," right? It has prevented me from having children. In other words, she clearly sees this as something emanating from the Lord, even though it doesn't explicitly state that. We know that they're childless. It doesn't say anywhere that God prevented Sarai from having children, but that's how Sarai views it, somewhat similar to, let's say, what we find in the book of Ruth, where Naomi attributes all the negative things that occurred to her to God, even though it doesn't explicitly state that God brought the death of her husband and children. So we see how the character, at least, understood it. She sees this as the will of God brought about by God, who prevented her from having children. So now she wants to accomplish it via her maid Hagar. And this, by the way, is something which we find in the ancient Near East. It's quite common. We also see it in other stories in the Torah. Of course, Jacob with his wives Leah and Rachel, both of them, Leah and Rachel, gave their maids to Jacob to have offspring. And this is something which is common. We see that the mistresses sometimes gave their maids to their husbands to have children via the maids, and the children that were born were considered belonging to the mistress, right? So that is the plan of Sarai. Maybe I shall obtain children, I will build via her and have children. The response at the end of the verse, and Abraham heeded the voice of Sarai, so Abraham accepts this proposal. In verse 3, then Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, notice again, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abraham to be his wife, after Abraham had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So here what's interesting is the explicit statement that Sarai gave Hagar to her husband Avram to be his wife. That might hint towards releasing the maid, if you will, and allowing her to marry. Now we have a second wife to Abraham, where Hagar no longer would seem to be Sarai's maid. Now she becomes Abraham's wife. And this occurs, we're informed, 10 years after they entered the land of Canaan. There were also certain laws and traditions developed from this, that the person should wait 10 years till he has children with a wife, but that is less related to our topic. So Abraham agrees with the idea, and then that leads to action. So he went into Hagar, and right, Vayavo Eleha, the translation here, and she conceived. And when she saw that she conceived, her mistress became deprecated in her eyes. By the way, this is my translation, the ending here. Deprecated. I viewed the different options in the different translations. I wasn't fond of any of them. Some of them are really not parallel to the text. So this basically the Hebrew says, "Vatekal gvirta beinea," her mistress became less honored in her eyes, deprecated in her eyes. And this raises a response on the side of, on the part of Sarai in the next verse. Then Sarai said to Abraham, "My wrong be upon you, or because of you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became deprecated in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So we see here the great sorrow on the part of Sarai. She is very much offended as a result of the behavior of Hagar, who no longer seems to show any respect to Sarai. So what occurred here? We have the proposal by Sarai. It is accepted by Abraham. That leads to the action. And now the result is Sarai suddenly, when she sees that Hagar is pregnant and sees how Hagar treats her, I think this definitely, I guess, offends her and I think also raises some negative feelings and also perhaps some blame on her part. She realizes that all these years it was because of her that Abraham has no children, and that might have also led her to feel less secure, less valued in her eyes, and she takes it very, very difficult, in a very difficult manner, and she comes to Abraham and says, "Look, I did something for you," even though she also did it for her sake. But listen, I gave you my maid, and look what happens. Now she's showing me no respect. She feels that I'm doing things that are also for your behalf, and look what I get in return, being maltreated. And she brings in God once again, second time, even though God's not mentioned by the narrator, but mentioned by the character itself, Sarai, twice. The Lord judged between you and me. So this is the second time that Sarai approaches Avram in the chapter. This time with a complaint. The first time was with the suggestion, and now with a complaint regarding Hagar's behavior towards her, and Abraham allowing this to happen. So now Abraham has to make a decision, and he's in a difficult situation. Of course, he has to judge between his wife Sarai and now his newly given wife Hagar, who is pregnant. And this actual situation is not unique in the ancient Near East. In fact, we have sources, including in the Code of Hammurabi, law sources that relate exactly to these kind of situations, tensions between a first wife, a second wife, or tensions between a wife who gives her maid to her husband for the sake of having children. Let's take a look at the Code of Hammurabi here. I brought before you. See it? Laws 145 and 146 relate to the relationship between different women vis-a-vis their men. If a man take a wife and she bear him no children, and he intend to take another wife, if he take this second wife and bring her into the house, this second wife shall not be allowed equality with his wife. In other words, this law clearly states that the first wife, the original wife, is of a higher status. But that's, of course, two wives, free women who are taken as wives. Look at Law 146. If a man take a wife and she give this man a maidservant as wife, and she bear him children, and then this maid assume equality with the wife, because she has borne him children, her master shall not sell her for money, but he may keep her as a slave, reckoning her among the maidservants. So it's very interesting that we have two laws relating to the status of the first wife, and vis-a-vis the second wife or the maidservant, where with regard to the maidservant, there are limitations. He can no longer just sell her, get rid of her, but he can keep her as a slave. Namely, she has to be kept as a maidservant. She can't be considered an equal to his wife, who gave the maid to him. And so this relates to our situation here, where Hagar, the maidservant, suddenly after becoming pregnant, kind of deprecates, doesn't show respect to the mistress. And now the mistress is offended and saying, this is not right, Abraham, you have to put her in her place, right? And determine who is the mistress, who is your real wife. And now Abraham has to respond. So look at Abraham's response. So Abraham said to Sarai, indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please. So Abraham says, okay, she's your maid. I'm giving her back to you as your maid, which is kind of parallel to what we see in the code of Hammurabi, where she can be made a slave, a maidservant. So that's what he basically tells Sarai. She's in your hand. She's yours. And now look how Sarai responds. And when Sarai oppressed her, she fled from her presence. The Hebrew word is pretty strong here, and I chose oppress. If we look at the Hebrew, the word is, and I'll emphasize it here, Bate'aneha Sarai, Bate'aneha. Some English translations translate she treated her harshly. It's even stronger than that. Bate'aneha, she oppressed her, right? Some of the commentators also try to elaborate, even though this is not stated. Once again, Radak comments here that she even physically harming her or even cursing her, even though that's not stated. But she definitely treated her harshly in order to emphasize her status, that she is the mistress in charge, and Hagar is her maid, is her servant. And the response here is, on Hagar's part, "Vativrach mipanea," so she flees from Sarai's hand. Now, the description here may have, and the usage of the word "vate'anea," she oppressed, may be of great consequence, especially in evaluating the behavior of Sarai. Because on the one hand, Hagar seems to show disrespect, and that is inappropriate. In other words, she doesn't understand her position, that she's still a maid and she's second to Sarai, as the hierarchy in the ancient world between the maids, the servants, and their masters. And here Hagar is overstepping the boundary and treating Sarai inappropriately, deprecating her. On the flip side, Sarai is taking vengeance here. And the word is pretty extreme, right? To oppress Hagar. And this may also lead to an analogy, because it connects us with some other appearances of the verb inui, oppression. And primarily, I'm referring to, of course, the enslavement in Egypt in the book of Exodus, right? Let's just see the Hebrew here. We're in Exodus 1, verses 11 and 12. Vayasimu alav, we're talking about the enslavement of the Israelites by the Egyptians. Vayasimu alav sarei misim, so they put ministers of taxes, leman anoto, in order to, and that's the same root, la'anot, to oppress them in their sufferings. And they build them, the slaves built cities for Pharaoh, right? And as they were oppressed, kasher yanu, so again, that same verb, yanu, inui, ken yirbe v'chen yifrotz, the Israelites grew in number. So first of all, we have that common verb, inui, oppression. The Egyptians oppressed the Israelites, right? And in my opinion, this is my own suggestion, there may be a direct reference back to the story, to our story in Genesis. Because look at the word used, vayasimu alav sarei misim. Sarei, like ministers, sar, but is of course the exact same spelling as sarai. Is there, in my opinion, there may be here a hint going back, namely that we're seeing the Egyptians oppress the Israelites in a similar way that Sarai oppressed the Egyptian Hagar, right? And this leads to the possibility that the behavior of Sarai, first of all, is depicted here negatively, like the Egyptian oppression of the Israelites. There may also be a connection between the two. By the way, remember that that same verb of inui, to oppress, also appears in chapter 15 in the covenant of the pieces, where God informs Abraham that his offspring will suffer in a foreign land, and there it also says ve'inu otam, they will oppress them 400 years. So it's interesting. We obviously know that foreign land is Egypt as readers, and that's the explicit description later on. So perhaps the analogy here is even stronger, not only depicting Sarai's behavior negatively, but maybe even drawing a connection. Sarai oppressed the Egyptian Hagar, and perhaps a long-term consequence will be also what appears later on, where the descendants of Sarai will be oppressed by the Egyptians. Okay, it's true that the covenant of the pieces appears before our chapter, but it of course anticipates as a prophetic vision what is going to happen, and therefore it can inform us of the ultimate events, not why. And there's a possibility still of accepting this as perhaps an interconnection between the stories, namely the oppression of Hagar the Egyptian by Sarai may also eventually be connected and even be seen as a possible punishment. The descendants of Sarai being oppressed in Egypt. Nachmanides Ramban also is very critical of Sarai's behavior, but he doesn't make here in this story a connection with the enslavement in Egypt. He did so in chapter 12, when Abraham and Sarai went down to Egypt. But he just says that the descendants of Hagar, Ishmael, will cause a lot of suffering as punishment later on in future generations. One more comment, it's interesting that Joseph is taken down to Egypt by a caravan of Ishmaelites, so he pops in there as well. Okay, so back to our story, we see Sarai acting with vengeance and leading to suffering on part of Hagar, to the point where she has to flee. Now, evaluating the characters here, on the one hand, Hagar wasn't behaving properly and showing respect to Sarai, and maybe lacking sensitivity to Sarai. On the flip side, it seems like Sarai's acting with an extreme response, which perhaps is also somewhat uncalled for, even though it may be in accordance with law. In other words, we saw, for example, in and custom in the ancient Near East, because we saw in the Hammurabi law that you can put the maidservant in her place, and she can be held as a servant, right? And that's what Sarai is doing, perhaps in a somewhat of an aggressive way. But even if it is perhaps permissible by law, I think the usage of tehaneh, right, the oppress, that verb, may show a negative evaluation also on the side of Sarai's behavior. Okay, so she fled from her presence. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to shore. First of all, we'll comment that this is the first appearance of an angel before a person in the Bible, and it happens to be before the Egyptian maidservant, quite surprisingly. And this angel of the Lord found her, and notice the double usage of the word spring, by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to shore. In Hebrew, the word spring is ayin, right? And this may be a play on words on what we see in the previous verses, where we have the mention of the word ayin with the meaning of eyes, right? I became deprecated in her eyes, in verse 5. And indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please, which is not a literal translation, because the Hebrew, if we'll take a look, says as follows. First of all, we'll show you the Hebrew, the ayin, but the kalkvirita be'ineha, in her eyes. She became deprecated in her eyes. And then Vaikal be'ineha, again in her eyes. I became deprecated in her eyes. And then Abraham's response, literally, do to her as you see fit in your eyes. And now we have a double mention in the appearance of the angel. He finds her al ain yod nun, al ain hamayim bamidbar, al ha'ain. We may have a play on words here with the eyes previously, and now al ha'ain, which here means, right, the fountain by which the angel finds her. By a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way of shore. So we're in the wilderness, we're in the desert area, and here we have a mention of shore, which is also mentioned, interestingly enough, upon the departure of the Israelites from Egypt after crossing the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 15, right after the song of Moses and the people of Israel praising God for saving them. So we're informed that they immediately get to the desert of Shur after 3 days, and they have no water, right? So it's interesting here. We have similar places mentioned in the oppression of and in the departure from Egypt after their oppression in Egypt, and now, just like the Israelites escaped to the desert of Shur, interestingly enough, Hagar made it to a fountain, right, a spring on the way to shore. Okay, and he said, so the angel approaches Hagar and tells her, Hagar, Sarai's maid. Notice the reference to her status, right? Shifcha, right? Sarai's maid. Where have you come from, and where are you going? 2 questions, right? The response, she said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai, right? Sarai's maid, mistress, same, right? Gvirti, right? Even the angel actually approaches Hagar and says, you are Sarai's maid. And he relates to Sarai as the mistress, as, right, as the owner of Hagar. Interestingly enough, the angel asks 2 questions, but Hagar only answers 1. She only answers the question, where have you come from? I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. She does not say, where are you going? The reason for that is perhaps what's the essence of Hagar's response, of her behavior, is fleeing. She doesn't necessarily want to go, but she has to flee from Sarai's oppression. That's what's at hand here. Where is she going? She's maybe not so certain. Apparently, she's heading south, so she wants to head back to Egypt, where she originally came from. And now the angel continues. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. So he commands her to return, which is quite surprising because usually runaway slaves, according to the Torah, are meant to run away, and you're forbidden from having them taking them and returning them to their masters. But here, the angel tells Hagar to return to her mistress and submit herself. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. Now there's a promise of great offspring, which is, of course, reminiscent of the promises given to the patriarchs, right, to have countless offspring. But this time, this promise is directed towards Hagar, quite surprisingly. So we have a bunch of surprises here. First of all, the appearance of an angel, right, for the first time, and before this poor, wretched runaway maidservant in the desert. And second, we have a promise, which kind of parallels the promises given to the patriarchs of having many offspring. And the angel of the Lord said to her, by the way, it's the third time the angel is speaking. The Hebrew, if we'll go back to it, always has vayomer. Take a look. Vayomar. So the first time in verse 8, and he asks her, where are you going? Where are you coming from? Where are you going? And then, Vayomer la, Malach Hashem. He tells her to return. In verse 10, Vayomer la Malach Hashem again. And in verse 11, Vayomer la Malach Hashem. So we have 3 verses in a row where we have that language of Vayomer la Malach Hashem, and the angel of God said to her. Quite monotonous. The English translation tries to diversify. The angel of the Lord said to her, then the angel of the Lord said to her, and the angel of the Lord said to her. But the literal translation would have translated, the angel of the Lord said to her 3 times, right? The first time commanding her to return, second time a promise of having many offspring, and now the third time, and the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand shall be upon all, and all hands shall be upon him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. So we have 3 speeches by the angel of God, and every time with an opening, the angel of God said to her. Now the angel of the Lord said to her. Why this triple opening? Right, the angel of the Lord said to her. So this is a common phenomenon, the repetition of Vayomer. And in this instance, I think we have 2 options. We can say that maybe the angel says something, but apparently Hagar did not respond to the first communication, commanding her to return. So then he promises her, listen, you're going to have many offspring, and maybe that wasn't sufficient. And then finally he gives her a more explicit blessing that he shall have a child, and etc. And only then does she respond. So it might be a lack of response leading to further communication. That's one option, which we find sometimes in the repetition of Vayomer, and he said. Another alternative is that the text here divides the speech into 3, because each one has its own content and has to be basically isolated separately because of its import. 1, the command to return. 2nd, the promise of many offspring. And finally, the actual specific prophecy regarding her son here will be born, Ishmael. As far as the future prophecy about her son, so he will be. We have the name given, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael. So it's interesting that she is the one who's commanded to give him the name Hagar, which is of course something surprising, because usually, and we saw this, for example, with Rachel and Leah's maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, when they gave birth, it is the mistress who gives the name, right? But now Hagar is informed, you shall call his name Ishmael, which maybe shows her status, right? You will be kind of the mother who will determine the name here. And why this name Ishmael? So this is, of course, based on the Hebrew Shama, right? Because the Lord has heard. Shama means to hear. Because the Lord has heard your affliction. Shama Hashem et onyech, your oppression, your affliction, right? So here we have a return to the issue of oppression. God has heard your oppression. And therefore, you will call him Ishmael, because God has heard your suffering. And now we also have a description of this future son. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, in Hebrew, Pere Adam. Now, how to understand this and what comes right afterwards is something which is really in disagreement amongst the commentators. Most view this in a negative light, and you can see almost all English translations translate this negatively. A wild man, his hand shall be upon all. Usually translate shall be against all hands shall be against him, right? Usually, obviously carrying a negative connotation of people will be fighting with him, he will be wild, and people will always be in conflict with him. And so this is often translated in a very negative light. However, in recent commentaries, more modern commentaries, some have viewed this in a positive light. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, emphasizing his freedom. He will roam free, even though you are commanded to return and suffer under your mistress, but your son will be free, right? He shall be a wild donkey of a man. And his hand shall be upon all, and all hands shall be upon him. If interpreted positively, are viewed as descriptions of either military might or economic might. He'll be powerful, or he'll be also wealthy, dealing in commerce with all, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. If we want to view it positively, not that he'll be dependent upon others, but rather that he shall be widespread. So there are really two directions here that are actually quite contradictory. We view here the descriptions of Ishmael in a positive light as somebody who will be free and successful, or somebody who will be in a negative light, very wild, uncontrollable, and constantly in conflict and dependent upon others. So there are different approaches here. If we want to view the words of the angel here as things that are meant to soothe and help Hagar, so the more positive description would be preferred, but it's really unclear here how this description is to be understood. What is clear is that Hagar is found in the desert, right? And her son, in these descriptions also, will seem to be one, we'll see this also later on, who will dwell in the desert, right? And this is foreshadowing the dwelling of the Ishmaelites in the desert areas in the south. So we have the communication of the angel of God in this very surprising manner to Hagar. And then this is followed by Hagar's response in verse 13. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. El Roi, we'll see it in the Hebrew. Ata El Roi, the God who sees. You have seen me, right? Ki amra hagam halom ra'iti acharei ro'i, which is translated here. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees, for she said, have I also here seen after he who sees me? In other words, even in a desert, the one who sees me, right? Or all right, El Roi, the one who sees me, or the one who is seen. There are two possibilities of explaining. English here went for the one who sees me, right? So she basically expresses her surprise that even here in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, her overseer, her God who sees her, the angel of God, right, even here sees me. Now, this is very surprising because we don't find, to the best of my knowledge, in any other place in the Bible, a name being given to an angel by the human. Right? Not only does the angel appear before Hagar, she gives him a name. Usually, right, the name is mysterious and withheld. You recall the story of Gidon and the appearance of the angel, to reveal his name, right? And we have the mystery of the angel appearing before Jacob. So, but here, the angel communicates, and it is Hagar who also gives the name to the angel, just like the angel told Hagar to give the name to her son, which is quite surprising. Verse 14 kind of limits that surprise when it says, therefore the well was called Be'er Lachairoi, the well of Lachairoi. Right, that's the name, the Hebrew name, right? The one who sees me, Roi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Beret. So maybe the angel, of course, doesn't reappear, he disappears, but testimony to that, the appearance of the angel is the name of the well, right? It was called Be'er Lachai Roi, the one who oversees me, right? As far as the root, we see the root seeing here quite a few times. Lord who sees, the Lord who sees, or I have also here seen after he who sees me, right? Now we have a combination of two verbs. First, we had the issue of hearing, right? The name Yishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction, right? So God hears Hagar, and now he sees her, right? The combination of these two verbs is well attested. They're a pair that come often, to hear and to see. And one place which comes to mind is once again in the story of the enslavement of the Israelites. If we look in Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, we have God speaking to Moses, and it says in Hebrew, Vayomer Hashem, Ra'o ra'iti, I have seen et oni ami. Now look at the word oni, right? Again, right, the oppression, the misery of my people, right? Vata'aneha, asher b'mitzrayim, in Egypt, ve'et tza'akatam shamati. So I have seen, right, their misery, and I have heard their screams, shamati. So this combination of ra'a and shama, we have also, once again, in the story of the enslavement of the Israelites, just like we find it here with that emphasis of Shama, God heard, Ishmael, and God, the angel, sees, right there, the Chai Ro'i. So we have another connection between the story here of Hagar, who flees, right, her being enslaved, and God hears her and sees her misery, just like God will eventually hear the cries of the Israelites and see the misery of the Israelites when they will be enslaved in Egypt. By the way, some commentators also commented on an analogy between Moses, perhaps, and Hagar, because Moses was in Egypt, fled, and went to Midian, and then returns to Egypt only to eventually be expelled and leave with the Israelites. So that's an interesting parallel there as well. There's a lot of connections between the stories, raising the possibility that there may be an interconnection here. As far as the mention of the location of that well, right, between Kadesh, this too connects us with the story of the departure from Egypt, because we are informed, this appears in Deuteronomy, in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, the last verse of the first chapter of Deuteronomy, we're informed after the sin of the spies that the Israelites dwelt for a lengthy period of time in Kadesh, right? So a lot of the places here also are reminiscent of places mentioned in the exile from Egypt. We mentioned already Shur, the desert of Shur, previously, and now we also mention Kadesh in this instance. The conclusion of the story. So Hagar bore Abram a son. So after Hagar returned, she bore Abram a son. And Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Now this is interesting because we expected Hagar, according to the prophecy, the revelation of the angel, to give the name. But here we're informed that it is Abram who named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. How is this to be understood? Two options can be contemplated. One, maybe the angel, of course, knowing the future, prophesied. Hagar already knew that this is the name, and Abraham by himself also gave the same name, of course, from a different perspective and with different meaning, because Ishmael vis-a-vis Hagar means God heard her suffering when she fled from Sarai, and with regard to Abraham, God heard his situation and his desire for a son and gave him a son. That's one option. Or it may well be that Hagar recounted the story to Abraham, even though this is not told by the text, not explicitly stated, and then Abraham accepts this name. Ramban, Nachmanides, raises that option as well. We don't know because the text doesn't elaborate. And finally, the last verse, Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham. Right? So if we summarize this closing section, what we see, first of all, is the constant mention of two characters, Hagar and Abraham, repeated. Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abraham, right? So we constantly have this repetition. Hagar, Abraham, Hagar, Abraham, Hagar, Abraham, and Ishmael, right? The repetition, of course, emphasizes who's missing, who is not mentioned in the final verses of the story, Sarai. And this is very interesting. The story emphasizes that Ishmael is the son of Hagar and Abraham. Even though Sarai gave Hagar and wanted to build herself via a son, right? This doesn't actually end up happening because the son who was born is not considered Sarai's son. Rather, it is Abraham's son through Hagar. What is the significance of this conclusion? So some modern scholars have considered these last verses to be added verses from a different source. They've attributed it to the P source, and the logic being that first of all, Sarai's not mentioned. She was very central earlier on in the narrative, and suddenly she's not mentioned. So there seems to be a lack of continuity. And also, we have some tension in that Abraham is the one who gives the name and not Hagar. So for that reason, many scholars, whether it be Gunkel, Skinner, or Westerman, others, have considered this to be from a different source. However, I wouldn't be so quick to reach that conclusion because the closing verses might have purposefully kept Sarai out, skipped Sarai, and not mentioned her, just to emphasize how things did not turn out how she planned. She was the motivating factor behind the whole chain of events. By the way, in the first half of the story, we see a double structure where both times it's Sarai who initiates, and then Abraham responds, and that leads to an action on the part of Abraham, and then we have the result. But in both instances, it is Sarai who's initiating. And then suddenly she is absent in the closing verses. This is a very vocal absence, right? It cries out, what happened to Sarai? And the purpose may be from a narrative perspective in order to show how things did not turn out how Sarai planned them to be, right? She did all this to get a son, but at the end, it's not her son. It's Abraham and Hagar's son. What is the message of this story? So first of all, I think the story relates, of course, to the tension between Sarai and Hagar. And we can look at the story from the different perspectives of these two women. From Hagar's perspective, it is a story of divine salvation, right? The angel of God who saves her, right, and gives her a son. So it definitely has a positive ring to her. Hagar is the one who gets to be the first biblical character before whom an angel appears, right? Which is quite surprising. She even gives a name, right? Even though the name eventually sticks to the well, not to the angel himself, right? So from her perspective, we have a story of salvation, and then if we approach it from that perspective, then this is a story that shows us how God looks after the oppressed, right? And what's interesting, and this was pointed out also by Casuto, in this instance, the oppressed is an Egyptian. And we learn from here, it doesn't matter who the oppressed is, right? If it's the Israelites who will be oppressed later on in history in Egypt, God hears them and sees their suffering. And also here, if it's an Egyptian maidservant, Hagar in the desert, God hears and sees, right, the crying of the oppressed. That is from the perspective of Hagar. From the perspective of Sarai, we have a story which is quite tragic and quite a failure, because everything she wanted, of course, did not materialize, because she not only gives her maid in order to build from her maid offspring for herself, her status is challenged, and she loses her confidence vis-a-vis Abraham, and eventually, right, a son is born whom is explicitly stated as not being her son, and we look further down the road in the story, this will be a son who will, right, challenge the status of an alternative son who will be born later on. So this story is quite negative and tragic from the perspective of Sarai. How harshly do we view Sarai's behavior? So some have taken it very negatively as far as Sarai's behavior. I think the text is not as clear-cut here, because we see also some inappropriate behavior on the part of Hagar, who shows disrespect to Sarai, and the angel explicitly constantly states that Sarai is the mistress, and Hagar is her maidservant, right? So that might be Hagar's fault in overstepping the boundaries and showing disrespect, and therefore Sarai may over-exaggerate in her response, but it's not that there's a clear, right, villain here and a clear hero, even though there is clearly a lot of sympathy to the situation of Hagar. They both don't come clean in this story. But finally, what's very interesting in the story is how it relates to the larger promise of offspring and the covenant between God and Abraham. Because in the previous chapter, we already saw there is the promise of offspring. And now in this chapter, we see a human initiative trying to accomplish that. And it turns out, in conclusion, that this human initiative is not what God had in mind. In other words, it doesn't correlate with the divine plan. And then the big question in my mind that arises from this story is, how do we view human initiative in trying to accomplish the divine promises vis-a-vis the divine plan? And in this instance, at least, it is clear that the human initiative is negative, has a negative outcome in that it will lead to tension, and was definitely not the planned route by by God's plan, and hence we have something which is quite ironic. The story begins with human initiative and action, but actually concludes with the appearance of an angel who hears and promise that he will remain and hear and be with the offspring of Hagar, with Ishmael, and he will multiply and become many. So in other words, what begins with human initiative ends with a story that actually emphasizes divine overseeing. Now, this is not the divine plan, but it turns out that God intervenes and helps Hagar, make sure she returns, because the son has to be born apparently with Abraham. But will also, as we know later on, will also make sure that they will leave. They will be expelled. But all this from the divine perspective. And so it seems that we have a critical response in the story to this human initiative, which doesn't follow the divine plan. They didn't know that, and Abraham and Sarah are trying. It's Sarai's initiative. By the whole story emphasizes that it's Sarai's initiative. Abraham is relatively passive and agrees, but ultimately he also agreed. So we have a human attempt to accomplish the covenant, the covenantal promises, but the manner in which this is performed is not according to the original divine plan. Now you can't blame the matriarch here for trying to accomplish the covenant, but what we learn from the story is that some promises are going to be accomplished not in a normal human vein, right? And God has a different plan for accomplishing the covenantal promises. The consequence of the human action is God has to step into the story. Why does the angel have to appear? Why do we need that special overseeing? Well, one can say, for one, because of Ishmael, who was the son of Abraham. But here it's focused on Hagar's suffering. Therefore, we have God here as the God who oversees the suffering, the downtrodden. But I would think, in addition, it might also have to do with God sensing that he has a responsibility here for the outcome as well. Because if we accept what Sarai stated in the beginning, that it was God who was, for the time being, preventing Sarai from having a child, this led to Sarai's initiative and leads to a son who is born by the maidservant, and this will create tremendous tension because of the divine plan. And hence, ultimately, a lot of this tension is also related to the divine plan and the tension between human action and divine plan, and therefore God here, I guess, comes to a certain extent to the rescue in repairing the outcome of some human initiatives which may be understood and totally legitimate in their own right, but within the context of the covenant and God's ultimate plan, they do not fit the divine plan. And hence God here has to react to the human initiative and, I guess, repair and limit the negative consequences. As far as the divine plan and how things will come to their fruition, well, that we will read in the coming chapters.